Hey guys, welcome to video number 22 for Mr. McGee's 9th grade biology course at Arizona School for the Arts. And today we're going to have an overview of photosynthesis. We had a very brief overview of photosynthesis and respiration in the last video. We're going to a higher level of detail in discussing photosynthesis today, and then followed by an even more detailed look into photosynthesis a little bit later. So let's just kind of recap. We have this idea that there's a relationship between matter and energy in living things. And for the purposes of discussing photosynthesis, we really need to remember some of the sources of matter and energy that are involved. So the sun, the ultimate source of energy, obviously. There's other forms of energy like light and chemical bonds and electrons. And then the matter that's involved is CO2 and H2O and O2, and a couple of other kinds. One of the more important chemicals that are involved in the storage of energy is this one. It's called ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's got adenosine, which is a nitrogenous base, ribose, which is a pentose sugar, and then some phosphates. Ribose, adenosine, phosphates. It turns out that ATP is a substance you've already learned about. It's a derivative of the nucleotide AMP, which is one of the nucleotides that's used in making RNA. The only difference between adenosine triphosphate and the adenine in RNA is the addition of two more phosphates. Now, those two phosphates are important because those are the bonds between the phosphates are what are used to store energy. ATP can be broken down into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and PI, which is the inorganic phosphate, which is just a phosphate molecule by itself. And in building up ATP, a cell can store energy, and in breaking it down, it can release the energy in that storage molecule. So let's start out with the molecules of ADP and PI. And they'll be floating around inside every cell of your body. And when they need to be converted into ATP, there's a special mechanism that grabs the pieces and puts them together. And that process is called ATP synthesis. It involves making a bond between ADP and PI. When that happens, you get ATP, and that results in a high energy bond between the second and the third phosphate here in an ATP molecule. When that bond is broken, there's a kinetic energy that is released that pushes the phosphate, the inorganic phosphate, away, and that kinetic energy is then captured by other components in the cell and used to do work. And here we are, we're back to where we started with ADP and PI. Another kind of molecule that's important for energy storage and photosynthesis is this. It's electron carriers. Now imagine that Hector is having a barbecue, and for some reason it turns out that having just one barbecue isn't enough. It turns out that he is going to make more food than he initially planned for. See, he was thinking that he only really had a couple of friends, but it turns out that when you offer people food, they'll do just about anything for you. So, a lot of people end up showing up at Hector's party, and it turns out that he needs to make more food, so he's got to start his other grill. Now, he's got one grill going, with lots of high-energy hot coals burning away. He'd like to start this other grill, and so the question is, how is he going to move the coals from grill number 1 to grill number 2? Well, if I know Hector, he's just going to try and reach out and grab them, and that's going to be painful. Or you could use a tongs. The tongs can safely transfer the burning hot coals from one grill to the other. Well, electron carriers do sort of the same thing. As light is absorbed by the molecule chlorophyll, it excites electrons. It gives them lots and lots of energy. And those high energy electrons are going to travel throughout the thylakoid membrane in the chloroplast, and they're going to potentially damage the components of that membrane unless they are handled properly. And in the case of the electron carriers, in the case of the electrons from photosynthesis, they need to be picked up by a molecule called NADP+. So let's see if we can visualize this a little bit better. We've got photons coming from the sun. Pew! And they're going to be absorbed by pigment A in the chloroplast. And that's going to make pigment A all excited. Woo, it's excited! Which is going to result in exciting electrons. Now you have a high energy electron that can't stay there. It's going to move. The problem is it's got to go from pigment A to pigment B without damaging every other part of the cell. And that's where NADP plus comes in. It's going to pick up that high energy electron and transport it from pigment A, where it's produced, to pigment B, where it can do some work. So it turns out that NADP has one job. It accepts 2 high energy electrons and 1 hydrogen ion. And when it does this, it becomes NADPH. You can remember this because pH are the first 2 letters in the word photosynthesis. NADPH carries the high energy electrons from photosynthesis to other parts of the cell. When NADPH breaks down into NADP+, and it releases the hydrogen ions, and the 2 electrons that it was carrying can then be used for energy. So the cell that's performing photosynthesis has 2 molecules that can be used to capture energy. NADP+ and hydrogen ions combine with 2 electrons to make NADPH, so it stores energy that way. Or ADP and PI can be combined to make ATP. Likewise, the cells that are undergoing photosynthesis can release energy in 2 ways. NADPH can be broken down into NADP+ and hydrogen ion and 2 high energy electrons. And ATP can be broken down into ADP and PI, releasing kinetic energy. So let's take a look at what these 2 molecules have to do with photosynthesis. Remember this diagram? It shows us the basic raw materials like carbon dioxide and water that are used to create sugar and oxygen waste as part of the plant's photosynthetic processes. It turns out that photosynthesis is a bit more complicated. We can divide photosynthesis in 2 different sets of reactions. The light-dependent reactions, where sunlight is absorbed and water molecules are split into oxygen and hydrogen, and the light-independent reaction that uses ATP and NADPH from the light reactions to combine CO2 molecules into sugars. The raw materials of photosynthesis are elaborated here. The ultimate source of energy is, of course, sunlight. The reactants are carbon dioxide and water. The products are sugar, like glucose, and oxygen, which is a waste. And then energy storage takes place in molecules of ATP and NADP+. Now, what we haven't seen before is that inside the chloroplast, the thylakoid membrane is studded with little clusters of pigments that are called photosystems. And I want you to know that because eventually when we look into greater detail of photosynthesis, it'll become important to know what clusters are in the thylakoid membrane and how they're arranged. So let's take a look at the light-dependent reactions in greater detail. This process happens only in the presence of sunlight. Once the sunlight's gone, the light-dependent reactions stop. It takes place in the thylakoid membrane, utilizing the clusters of pigments that are there. This process absorbs water and produces oxygen gas as a waste. The main function of this process is to convert NADP into NADPH and to convert ADP and PI into ATP. In the light-independent reaction, we find that this process does not require sunlight. Rather, it uses the energy that's provided by NADPH and ATP from the light reactions. It takes place in the stroma. In this reaction, ATP and NADPH are used to combine molecules of CO2 into high-energy sugars. Here's what this looks like in the chloroplast itself. The light-dependent reactions take place in the thylakoid membrane, whereas the Calvin cycle, or light-independent reactions, take place in the stroma. You can see from this diagram there's actually a little bit more detail than we've covered so far, and we'll get into that in the next video. That's the end of this video. Please complete the corresponding review questions and be prepared to show me your notes in class. And as always, here's your bunny of the day.